The state of Florida is currently under fire by the residents for plans to take state parks, those preserved lands that we're not supposed to touch or do anything with, and turn them into golf courses and hotels for the state's wealthy elite. It's not out of the question for state parks to have these types of facilities. The question that matters here is that the parks were preserved in the state of Florida for ecological reasons, not for human development. A topic of debate for a lot of people in the state of Florida, uncontrolled development. Simply put, the notion of turning the state parks into construction sites doesn't sit very well with the residents of Florida, who are fed up with the state's uncontrolled development in recently efforts to turn preserved lands and areas that most of us understood would remain undisturbed by human development into pickleball courts and golf courses and hotels for the elite is definitely not something that the people of Florida want to hear. Most people understood that state parks were preserved lands that would always be devoted to nature and never be developed, so the notion really doesn't sit well with the residents of Florida. Moreover, there are many significant infrastructure projects that areas like Interstate 4 along Tampa to Orlando, the Crew Swamp, which separates an entire metropolitan area in half, that the residents have been eager for the state to deviate from preserved lands and allow infrastructure to go in to facilitate the day-to-day lives of the working commuters. For the Florida resident who has to spend hours every single day driving around these preserved lands, commutes that could take 15 minutes take hours. The state of Florida has never allowed variances for infrastructure projects to benefit these commuters, and now all of a sudden, the same areas that they couldn't put infrastructure through for traffic and commuters, the day-to-day lives of people, can all of a sudden be set aside for the elite people to play pickleball and tennis and golf in these areas that were, first of all, supposed to be preserved for nature. Take the Corkscrew Swamp, which separates Collier and Lee County in the heart of the metropolitan area. People who live around this nature preserve have to go on crowded roads like Highway 82 or Interstate 75. An elevated expressway across the Crew Swamp could save these commuters hours every single day, but the state of Florida refuses to build infrastructure in these areas, leaving the people that live in places like the Corkscrew Swamp vicinity and areas around Orlando completely having to go around these nature preserves, turning what could be a 10-minute commute into an hour and 15-minute commute because these areas are preserved. So for now, these areas that have been a hindrance to the infrastructure of the state of Florida and a huge inconvenience to the people that live and commute within the state of Florida can all of a sudden be set aside simply so that the elite can play golf on a nice resort. Take, for example, the project to put pickleball courts and other facilities in Anastasia State Park. It is located between St. Augustine and St. Augustine Beach. This area is now completely developed and the state park sits within the middle of the city. Many people think that this is the last enclave of natural Florida left, and to go in there and put more development in the last remaining enclave of nature is an absolute assault on the state of Florida. Many others feel that the types of facilities that are going in are catering to nothing more than rich elite tourists, and they're not activities that the normal people of Florida even engage in. Pickleball and golf are activities of the absolute wealthiest people in society. It's fairly understandable that the average Floridian who doesn't engage in these rich white sports, they're going to be somewhat aggravated at the notion that their state parks, the last remaining pieces of nature left in these metropolitan areas, are all of a sudden going to become golf courses too. But let's go back in time a little bit. Do you guys remember that not too long ago I made a video about how the state of Florida was purchasing land for Florida panther habitat? And I told you guys on that video, hey, this land that the state of Florida is purchasing is not exactly Florida panther habitat. It looks more like prime tourist resort type locations. That's what I said on that video. With all the new state parks that the state is purchasing, many people assume that these would be preserved lands for Florida panther habitat. But as you guys know, it is not uncommon when a state park is founded for the state to have to put in some type of facilities, buildings. There has to be something there for people to enjoy these areas. Now, in the past, it has been found acceptable that in these state parks, we need trails, we need kayak launching stations, we need bathroom facilities. All these installations are there to facilitate access into these nature areas and get people doing outdoor activities. The problem is that the new concept that the state of Florida is going with for these state parks could very well mirror, the projects that they're currently trying to put into the facilities that the state already owned that are now being turned into hotels and golf courses. In other words, if the state of Florida wants to put hotels and golf courses in the current state parks, what do you think is going to happen to all that land, those billions of dollars that the state recently invested into purchasing land for state parks? Now, we all understand that trails and kayak launches and bathrooms are necessary in state parks. It seems like what the state of Florida is doing is purchasing land adjacent to tourist hotspots and providing facilities like golf courses and pickleball courts as attachments to commercial investment tourist areas, claiming that it's a state park, but really it is nothing more than an attachment to a commercial tourist district providing state-funded allocations of resources for a private sector interest. Basically, the golf courses and pickleball courts that are normally within gated communities will now be available to people staying in these resorts. Now you're providing and allocating maintenance cost and building cost of facilities that are for the use of tourists, basically staying in resorts and hotels, but deferring that cost to the Florida public. Basically, many of the amenities that these tours want to access around these resort towns, these amenities like golf courses are usually in private hands or gated communities. Now, the state of Florida will provide those amenities within state parks adjacent to areas of tourism. Basically, if you look at the list of the current parks that the state of Florida wants to convert into golf courses, St. Augustine, the Tampa area, a few spots along the Panhandle, these are areas along the coast that see the most tourist traffic. Basically, the state of Florida is going to grab state parks and convert them into use of tourism. And this is exactly the type of thing that will probably make people in Florida extraordinarily angry. Now, the state of Florida doesn't have a state income tax, so it's understandable that the state has to depend on tourism to generate funds. And it's expected that if the state of Florida is making revenue from tourism, that they have to also allocate money for tourism. Does that mean now that the state of Florida's investments in state parks are going to cater not to the people that live in the state of Florida, but only to tourist interest? Even going as far as taking things that already belong to the people of Florida and shifting them over into commercial land use? Like I had mentioned in my previous video before this news came out about the state of Florida wanting to turn state parks into golf courses, if we just go back to that video I made about Florida panther habitat, I clearly denoted to you guys the clear fact that these areas didn't seem valuable for ecological purposes, they seemed valuable for tourist interest. And if the state of Florida is now purchasing land for quote-unquote preservation, but they're purchasing it adjacent to tourist areas, we can assume that the facilities that are going to go into these new state parks isn't going to be kayak launches and walking trails. It's going to be tennis courts and golf courses and, unfortunately, even hotels. Now, I have been telling you guys for a very long time, and I don't think anybody else on YouTube has been saying this. I've been the sole person telling you guys for a long time that the entirety of the state of Florida currently sits in the hands of developers who want to misappropriate the resources of the state of Florida for their own personal monetary gains, and that the people of Florida no longer own the state of Florida's resources. I've been telling you guys this for a very long time on YouTube. However, many of you guys are still blind to the notion that in the state of Florida, the regular people, our beaches and parks don't belong to us anymore. The lobbying of these developers every single day encroaches on state parks and public places. and every day aligns itself more with the needs of builders and developers and further from public interest. The frustration to many people in Florida is the realization that all that land that the state was purchasing for quote-unquote Florida Panther habitat will most likely actually be used to further the interests of developers and tourism, and that these facilities that are going to go in are going to look more like resorts and golf courses for the elite and less like nature. The idea that the state owns these natural areas and allows certain people to go in and enjoy it with tourist dollars is something similar to what the country of Cuba does, where the state controls the developer's ability to build in certain areas for tourism. This is a model that has proven very profitable for the communist regime of Cuba, where the state owns the land but allows developers and resorts to go in. This has been a very profitable business model for the state of Cuba, and the state of Florida is looking at Cuba and saying, wow, how can we generate massive profits by turning these preserve areas that the general public doesn't have access to into areas that we can devote solely to the tourist dollars. This model has been working great for decades for the state of Cuba, with its only real profitable endeavor out of many failed is grabbing areas that are preserve lands and allowing elite developers to go in. And of course, the costs are then split with the state, but at the end of the day, these natural preserve areas belong to the people of Cuba, and now only the tourists are allowed to use them. It seems like the model that the state of Florida wants to run with in the future when it looks at state parks is something similar to what happens in Cuba, where the state owns the land, but the state doesn't allow people, the regular working class person, to access these parks with any type of economical endeavor. What the state does allow is big developers to come in, build resorts and hotels, and then split the cost with the state. That's exactly what the state of Cuba has been doing for decades, being the only profitable economical activity that the country has seen literally in decades. Many European tourists are now flocking to Cuba. Canadians, Spaniards, Germans, and many people from Europe go to Cuba to stay in state resorts. Those are tourist dollars that would usually have stayed in the state of Florida. Many of those people are now traveling to Cuba. It's a model that simply works for tourism because you have all this beautiful, pristine land, you have these beautiful resorts, and you don't have to worry about any of the problems that come with the general population. It's a model that tourism and communism have perfected to give state resources to the tourists and elites from other places, and completely eliminating the local people's ability to enjoy these areas to the same degree. Even the types of facilities that are going in by the state of Florida are the type of activities that, of course, only rich people engage in. They're not putting basketball courts in. They're not putting soccer fields or baseball fields. This isn't for you and me, normal people in the state of Florida. This is for the elite. But once again, this is what's really happening in the state of Florida. Public resources that belong to the people of Florida are being diverted to protect the interests of developers. The state of Florida is becoming something like what Cuba is, where the tourists and the elite can come and enjoy all the natural areas and have all the accommodations catered to them, while none of those accommodations cater or are available to the general public. If you would like to do some further reading on this topic, my uncle Caleb Vega wrote a book called Anatomy of a Voyage to Freedom. In this book, it details exactly how tourism works in Cuba. Now, he is currently in the United States, and the book details his journey to the United States, and it also breaks down how the economy works in Cuba, tourism, and many of the other government sectors. He was an economist for the government, and he did have to flee for his life. To sum up the story, it seems that he figured out a way to divert the resources of the state to the people, and that's why he had to disappear from Cuba. There's a lot of misunderstanding today about how these types of governments actually work, but if you really do want to understand how exactly the state of Cuba manages tourism and how they control everything that happens over there, I'll include a link to his book in the video description if you like further reading. But basically, with the knowledge that I have on how Cuba handles tourism, it is very interesting that this is what the state of Florida is doing right now. But again, it's a model that has proven to work even in a dysfunctional country like Cuba. So there's no doubt that this is a proven method for the state to generate lots of money. But the problem is that it diverts public resources into the private sector and puts them at the feet of the elite while leaving the regular person like me and you completely out of the picture.